Section 1. Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to an era that makes your toughest camping trip feel like a weekend at a luxury spa. Picture this, you're curled up under a rough wool blanket in a smoky Viking longhouse. Your cousin is snoring, louder than a grizzly bear, and just inches from your feet is a goat whose hygiene leaves much to be desired. You're dressed in layers of linen and wool because in 9th century Norway, hypothermia is always just around the corner. Your mattress a thin sack of hay, shared with fleas that consider you the midnight snack. You probably wouldn't survive a single night in conditions like these, let alone an entire lifetime. But don't worry, tonight you get to enjoy Viking bedtime without any of the frostbite or livestock-induced insomnia. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe it, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where and when you're watching this. I love seeing where history enthusiasts gather. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're settling into your first sleep, and if that sounds strange, just wait, it gets weirder. Unlike the standard 8-hour snooze you're used to, Vikings split their nights into 2 distinct sleeps, each lasting around 4 hours. Think of it like hitting the pause button halfway through your favorite Netflix show to suddenly reorganize your sock drawer at midnight. Right now, as you drift off after a hearty meal of smoked fish and thick barley porridge, you're entering first sleep. Don't worry if you wake up around midnight feeling oddly alert, that's entirely normal. Back then, nobody panicked if they opened their eyes in the middle of the night. It wasn't insomnia, it was culture. But here's the kicker. That midnight interval wasn't for scrolling TikTok or binge-watching cooking tutorials. Vikings got busy. And I mean literally busy. Chores, quiet contemplation, even sharpening axes. Yes, sharpening axes. You thought your midnight snack runs were extreme. Imagine waking up at midnight and deciding, this is the perfect time to put a razor-sharp edge on my battle weapon. Vikings considered it practical and, let's face it, also pretty badass. Surprisingly, segmented sleep wasn't just some quirky Viking thing. It was common across pre-industrial Europe. Without artificial lighting to keep them awake, humans naturally fell into this 2-part rhythm. It was basically humanity's original factory setting before modern technology and Triple S reprogrammed us all. The Vikings simply leaned into this natural rhythm because in a society where you could wake up with a rival clan raiding your home, restful sleep came with certain tactical considerations. Speaking of raids, you might think being abruptly woken up at midnight sounds stressful, and you'd be absolutely right. But remember, stress in the Viking Age wasn't about meeting deadlines or dealing with a difficult boss. It was more along the lines of not being speared through the chest by an angry rival. The middle of the night wakefulness was less a choice and more a survival mechanism. If you're awake at the darkest hour, your enemies lose their element of surprise. Take that, invaders. Historians still debate exactly how widespread segmented sleep was, especially outside Northern Europe. Some argue it was a global norm, others suggest it varied depending on the season or geographic location. But one thing is clear, for Vikings, waking up at midnight wasn't the exception, it was the rule. And they didn't complain. They adapted, finding creative uses for their sleepless hours, sometimes more creative than you'd expect. Now, consider intimacy. Yep, you heard me. Archaeological findings and historical sagas suggest midnight was a preferred time for romance among Viking couples. And honestly, it makes sense. You'd rested just enough to feel rejuvenated but weren't so exhausted from the day's work. Plus the fire was already burning. And nothing says romance like flickering flames and the distant snoring of your extended family. Seriously though, some historians suggest that certain Viking communities may have even timed their entire procreative schedules around this midnight interval. That's right, midnight booty calls, Viking style. But don't romanticize it too much. Remember, you're still sleeping on a cold dirt floor, nestled between a few chickens, 2 cousins, and your trusty axe. Privacy wasn't exactly a Viking concept. If personal space is your jam, Viking bedtime is definitely not for you. But hey, at least you're warm, sort of. You see, in a Viking longhouse, your main source of heat was a central fire pit that constantly smoked out the entire household. The smoke drove away pests, preserved meat, and coated your lungs in a protective layer of soot. Cozy, right? If you think it sounds crowded, that's because it was. An average Viking longhouse was a bustling communal space housing entire families. Servants, visiting relatives, and animals. The closer you slept to the central fire, the higher your social status. Sleeping near the fire meant warmth and privilege. Sleeping near the door, that meant you were either a guest of questionable value or someone the family didn't particularly trust. Sleeping near the livestock, congratulations, you officially had fewer rights than the family goat. Strangely enough, this communal sleeping arrangement probably strengthened social bonds. There's something about enduring your uncle's midnight poetry recitations or your aunt's sleep talking about Odin's disappointment in her weaving skills that really brings people together. Sure, modern folks might cringe at the idea of sleeping inches away from snoring relatives and farting livestock, but Vikings accepted it as part of everyday life. They didn't have sleep hygiene guidelines. They had survive until morning guidelines. Comfort was a luxury, not a priority. And speaking of priorities, always remember the Viking bedtime rule number 1, never be more than an arm's length away from a blade. No, seriously. The idea of going to bed unarmed was about as absurd to Vikings as showing up to battle without pants. Archaeologists have even found evidence that some warriors literally slept clutching their weapons, like a child holding onto a favorite stuffed animal, only sharper, deadlier, and significantly less cuddly. And that's just the start of your Viking bedtime journey. As you drift through the haze of smoke and the gentle, soothing sounds of goats softly chewing on your boots, know that you're just experiencing a taste of Viking life. Tonight, you get to skip the frostbite and axes, lucky you. But as you close your eyes and settle into your modern mattress, be thankful your midnight wakefulness involves fewer weapon sharpening sessions. Sleep well, friend. Our journey has just begun. You're back in the Viking longhouse, drifting slowly through the dreamy haze of smoke, straw, and lightly snoring animals. You've survived your first sleep, and now you find yourself awake in that quiet, mysterious midnight interval. It's dark, like pitch dark. Imagine your modern-day power outage, but instead of fumbling around for a flashlight or your phone, you simply reach out and grasp your trusty axe because, priorities. And speaking of priorities, you notice your stomach growling a bit. Midnight munchies are definitely not just a modern phenomenon. Vikings were practical folks, after all. With no refrigerators, snack cabinets, or 24-hour convenience stores, they kept provisions close at hand. Right now, you're reaching for some dried fish or leftover stewcold, slightly congealed and oddly comforting at this hour. Sure, it's no late-night pizza delivery, but it'll keep you alive through winter, and that's good enough for a Viking midnight snack. Historians actually suggest that midnight eating wasn't an indulgence, it was survival. After a day spent rowing, farming, or dragging livestock through knee-deep snow, waking up hungry in the dead of night wasn't unusual, it was expected. And let's face it, munching quietly by a dwindling fire in the middle of a freezing night is peak Viking culture. If your neighbor complains about your chewing sounds, just remind them the goats make more noise than you do. Speaking of noise, the midnight interval wasn't just about snacks, it was also a time for reflection. Picture yourself sitting by the glowing embers, contemplating life, death, and whether Odin might secretly judge your sword skills. Without smartphones, Netflix, or podcasts to distract you, midnight Viking life was genuinely introspective. Dreams from the first sleep were especially significant, considered clearer and more meaningful, almost like prophetic whispers from the spirit world. In fact, Vikings believed dreams could offer crucial glimpses into the future, warning of impending danger or signaling divine favor. Did your first sleep include a dream about wolves chasing your village? Congratulations, you're probably doomed. But dream of Odin quietly nodding in approval, and you might just win your next raid or harvest season. Vikings took their dreams so seriously they had designated interpreters, spiritual figures skilled in decoding these midnight visions. These were less like therapists and more like mystical advisors who cared far more about symbols of ravens and broken swords than your anxiety over goat taxes. Historians still debate how widespread and uniform Viking dream interpretation practices actually were. Some argue that the importance of dreams was exaggerated in sagas to dramatize heroic narratives. Others think dream interpretation was indeed central to Viking spirituality and daily life. Either way, midnight wasn't just downtime, it was a deeply spiritual, introspective space that modern folks might envy, assuming you can ignore the goats, fleas, and freezing temperatures, of course. But spirituality aside, let's talk about romance again for just a moment. Because midnight intimacy was not just an occasional quirk, it might have been strategic. Remember those procreative schedules I mentioned earlier? Some scholars think that the midnight interval wasn't just an ideal time for couples to connect, it was culturally embedded in their idea of fertility. A little practical romance before second sleep wasn't just about pleasure, it was about maintaining the population. Vikings, it seems, had their own version of date night, without scented candles or Barry White playlists. Though now let's shift back to your practical midnight chores, because Viking life was never short on practicality. Maybe you're tending the dying embers, checking livestock, or quietly sharpening a spear because, yes, again, weapon maintenance never sleeps. Your neighbors might be whispering softly, sharing stories, or quietly debating whose turn it is to check on the chickens. This wasn't idle gossip. It was nightly routine and part of the rich communal tapestry of Viking life. But imagine for the moment it's not just a quiet night at home. Imagine you're traveling, on a raid, or aboard a longship. The midnight interval shifts drastically from calm reflection to heightened vigilance. On long voyages, Vikings organized sleep shifts, because someone had to stay awake and scan the dark horizon for enemy sails or dangerous reefs. This practice was as much about pride as safety. Deep sleep was considered a luxury reserved for those not expecting surprise attacks, which, let's be honest, wasn't very Viking. Picture yourself now, perched on a cold, wet plank, straining your eyes through freezing rain as you scan the darkness. This midnight watch wasn't glamorous, it was downright miserable, but it kept everyone alive, and Vikings respected that practical sacrifice deeply. Falling asleep during your shift, well, let's just say your friends might prank you in ways involving your helmet and bodily fluids. Vikings had a rough sense of humor. Even at home in the relative comfort of your longhouse, someone was always on watch. Maybe they stayed up to tend the fire, listen for wolves, or gently persuade the family goat to stop gnawing on someone's boot. If your settlement was larger, guards might patrol the perimeters or keep watch from lookout towers. This constant vigilance wasn't just practical, it was cultural identity. A Viking was expected to sleep lightly, suspiciously, and always with one hand near a weapon. Sleep wasn't passive, it was strategic. And if you're going to survive the Viking Age, you'll want to master that subtle art of sleeping while remaining slightly paranoid. It's easy to romanticize this now, but let's be clear. Waking up at midnight, in a dark, smoky longhouse next to your snoring relatives and a very judgmental goat, probably wasn't as serene as modern nostalgia makes it sound. You're probably tired, your feet are freezing, and your midnight snack is at best questionably appetizing. But there's something oddly comforting about knowing you're following a rhythm that humans observed for thousands of years. It connects you to ancestors whose lives revolved around seasons, daylight, and survival rather than deadlines, caffeine and late-night scrolling. That as your eyelids grow heavy again, you're slipping toward your second sleep. This second phase is usually deeper, dream-filled, and restorative, preparing you for another day of farming, raiding, or, yes, goat herding. You might feel relieved knowing you survived another midnight without attacks, prophetic dreams of doom, or any unfortunate incidents involving sharp weaponry. Congratulations, you're one night closer to being a true Viking. So, ease yourself gently back into rest, letting your breathing slow to match the soft whispers of wind outside the longhouse walls. Your second sleep awaits, friend, deep and restorative. Sleep well, warrior. There's always tomorrow to sharpen your axe again. Your second sleep gently carries you away, wrapped snugly in woolen layers, drifting into the soft darkness of the longhouse. By now you've become strangely accustomed to your cozy arrangement between relatives, livestock, and weaponry. It's almost peaceful, well, peaceful as it gets when you're inches from a cousin who snores like an angry walrus. But your rest is brief because the Viking lifestyle didn't exactly allow for leisurely mornings under plush duvets. You awaken at dawn, or rather, as soon as the first faint glow of sunrise penetrates the smoke-filled haze of your communal bedroom. Stretching quietly, you notice your limbs ache from sleeping on a thin sack of hay and earth. No memory foam here, just plain old dirt and straw, filled with enough fleas to make a modern pest controller weep with joy. But Viking life wasn't about comfort. It was about endurance. The goal wasn't to feel refreshed, but simply to be warm enough to avoid frostbite and alert enough to dodge sudden attacks from neighbors who thought borrowing sugar meant raiding your food storage. Speaking of raids, mornings often began with assessing whether your livestock was still around, or if they'd been borrowed overnight by those suspicious neighbors again. Your goats are present, thank Odin, but the chickens appear to be plotting something, as chickens often do. The cow beside you snorts softly, unimpressed with your attempts at a morning stretch. Sleeping with livestock wasn't a quirky tradition. It was strategic. Animals provided essential warmth during frigid Scandinavian nights. A single cow radiated enough heat to warm an entire corner of the longhouse. Several cows. Congratulations, you've got medieval floor heating. The occasional surprise hoof to the face was just a small price to pay. As you rise, you notice everyone around you fully dressed, because Viking pajamas were literally just your daytime clothes. Removing clothing to sleep was essentially declaring you'd given up the battle against winter, an admission no self-respecting Viking would ever make. Instead, layers of linen, wool, and fur stayed firmly wrapped around your body all night. Armor was optional but not uncommon, because nothing screams comfort like sleeping in a metal shirt. Historians continue to debate exactly how widespread sleeping in armor was among Viking warriors. Some argue it was strictly a wartime necessity, while others suggest even ordinary Vikings occasionally slept wearing partial armor. One thing's for sure, if you woke to enemies bursting through your door, you'd prefer not to spend precious moments fumbling with chainmail or, Odin forbid, pants. Vikings valued readiness over comfort, a philosophy you'd quickly adopt if survival was your primary hobby, and readiness meant weapons always close, always within reach. It wasn't paranoia, it was practicality. Archaeological evidence shows Vikings didn't store their weapons safely away in racks or chests overnight. Instead, axes leaned casually against walls, swords nestled beside pillows, and spears wedged beneath sleeping mats like a family photo on your bedside table, only significantly sharper and potentially deadly. A Viking would sooner sleep without a pillow than without a blade within easy reach. Sure, accidental midnight injuries were a risk, but better a nicked finger than becoming fodder for someone else's heroic saga. Now let's talk about your actual bed. If you're picturing some lavish four-poster draped in silks, you've been watching too many historical dramas. Unless you were wealthy or noble and, let's face it, Statistically, you're probably not. Your Viking bed was essentially glorified dirt. Maybe you got lucky and slept on a wooden platform or bench padded with moss or straw. If fortune wasn't on your side, you were sprawled directly on the packed earth floor, wrapped in animal pelts and hoping desperately your spot wasn't too close to the goat droppings. Comfort was minimal, but warmth was non-negotiable. And don't even think about cleanliness. Viking beds weren't flipped or aired out seasonally. They were shaken out when the fleas got too assertive or when your straw mattress smelled suspiciously like livestock waste. Hygiene was about practicality, not luxury. The line between stable, kitchen, and bedroom was more a gentle suggestion than an actual architectural feature. Privacy that's adorable. Vikings had about as much privacy as modern-day airport security lines. Minimal, mildly awkward, and definitely shared with strangers, but even sleeping on dirt had advantages. The earth held heat surprisingly well, especially with family, livestock, and that annoying cousin pressed up against you. In winter, your shared body heat could be life-saving. Summer offered slightly more breathable conditions, though describing your sleeping arrangements as comfortable would still be generous. Let's just settle on survivable and call it a win. For Vikings of modest means, and by modest I mean you didn't own much besides your clothing, your livestock, and an axe that doubled as your pillow, the floor was home. Guests, travelers, and distant relatives usually slept near the doorway, a spot roughly equivalent to economy class on medieval airlines, functional, cramped, and the first to encounter trouble. If someone broke in, you'd literally be on the front line. Congratulations, your hospitality included involuntary guard duty. And speaking of guests, Viking sleeping arrangements were reflections of status. Household heads and honored elders secured positions close to the fire, surrounded by warmth and comfort. Children fit wherever space allowed, wedged between adults, animals, and sacks of grain. Servants and distant cousins slept on the outskirts, beside the door or the livestock pen. If your sleeping position suggested you were valued less than the family goat, well, it's nothing personal, just medieval logistics. While modern listeners might shudder at the crowded chaos, Vikings saw communal sleeping as normal and even necessary. Sleeping arrangements weren't simply about warmth, they reinforced social bonds, sharing stories in the flickering firelight, enduring your cousin's endless saga retellings, or cooperating to handle midnight goat rebellions. All these experiences, with built community and cohesion. Vikings didn't just survive their nights, they bonded through them. As daylight fully breaks and you shake off the lingering fog of your second sleep, it's time to rise and start the day. Maybe you'll milk the cows, mend a broken fence, or practice your sword skills for an upcoming raid. Perhaps you'll just glare suspiciously at your chickens, who still seem to be plotting something sinister. Whatever your day brings, your nighttime experience has connected you to generations of ancestors who survived harsh winters, midnight raids, and goat-induced insomnia. Stretching your stiff limbs, you realize you've adapted surprisingly well to this harsh but strangely comforting routine. You may not ever fully embrace sleeping with livestock or sharpening weapons at midnight, but you now understand it, and that's enough. Let daylight gently guide you forward. Another Viking day awaits. Sleep well again tonight, friend, knowing you're never truly alone. There's always a goat close by. Stepping out from the smoky warmth of the longhouse into the crisp, cool morning air, you find yourself blinking at the early sunlight streaming through a hazy Nordic dawn. It feels good, though you've definitely experienced gentler wake-ups than your Viking neighbors shouting cheerful insults about your axe-throwing skills. Vikings weren't known for gentle alarm clocks. After all, they preferred humor at your expense to coffee and polite small talk. As you adjust your layers of wool, linen, and animal fur, you realize this Viking morning routine is as much about survival as your segmented sleep was. You check your weapons, making sure your axe and knife are comfortably strapped to your side, ready for chores, self-defense, or that impromptu raid the neighbors keep threatening. If there's one universal Viking rule, it's this: always expect company, sometimes friendly, often not. You wander toward the livestock pen, passing children already chasing chickens with determination usually reserved for modern-day Black Friday shoppers. Chickens may look harmless, but any Viking knows better. These feathery creatures plot coups regularly, and since livestock represented food, warmth, and wealth, keeping them safe and accounted for was essential. Vikings didn't worry about keeping their livestock clean, but keeping them alive. Absolutely. Here's an odd Viking fact few people know. It wasn't uncommon to see chickens or goats brought indoors during extremely harsh weather, not just at night, but sometimes during storms or particularly bitter days. Imagine cuddling with your favorite goat during a winter blizzard. Romantic? No. Practical? Very much so. Historians continue to debate exactly how widespread indoor livestock practices were across Viking settlements. Some suggest it was common, while others argue it depended greatly on local climate and resources. Regardless, bringing animals inside wasn't unusual. It was just sensible animal management, Viking style. After ensuring no animals staged an overnight jailbreak, your attention turns toward breakfast. No fluffy pancakes or eggs Benedict here. Your morning meal is simple: hearty and focused purely on survival. A bowl of porridge made from barley or oats, some smoked fish left over from your midnight snack, maybe a little dried metizianchili, whatever wouldn't spoil overnight. Vikings valued simplicity, which was a nice way of saying there weren't exactly many culinary options. You might grumble about bland porridge, but at least you're eating. Winter scarcity was real, and Vikings lived in constant awareness of seasonal fluctuations in food supply. Fresh fruit or vegetables in winter. Laughable. Your vitamin C came from dried berries, your protein from fish and preserved meats. You might not feel gourmet satisfaction, but your meal was designed to sustain you for a hard day's work rowing, farming, or gently convincing your livestock not to wander into enemy territory. Speaking of farming, Viking agriculture was notoriously tough, partially because Scandinavia's harsh climate meant unpredictable harvests, and partially because your plow was probably made from wood and pure stubbornness. Forget modern fertilizers or machinery. You had sheer willpower and a determination strong enough to intimidate dirt into submission. Vikings farmed barley, oats, rye, and occasionally wheat if luck and weather allowed. Vegetables like cabbage, onions, and peas were staples, alongside root vegetables such as carrots or turnips, which could survive colder climates. Every meal you ate was a small victory over nature's constant attempts to starve you. Now, if farming isn't your style, maybe today you're heading to the shore to fish. Vikings, after all, were legendary seafarers, not just fierce raiders. Fishing wasn't leisurely, it was hard, grueling, and often dangerously cold work. Boats were small, waves were rough, and hypothermia was a genuine risk. On the bright side, you'd come home with fresh fish for dinner, or perhaps something more adventurous like seals or whales if luck favored you. Vikings weren't picky eaters, which was good because nature wasn't exactly a generous menu planner. But let's imagine your plans. Today involves something more exciting: shipbuilding. Viking ships were engineering marvels for their time. Sleek, swift, and remarkably sturdy, they allowed Vikings to cross vast oceans and strike fear into coastal villages throughout Europe. These ships weren't built by professional shipwrights alone. Ordinary Vikings like yourself lent hands to shaping planks, sealing hulls, and testing seaworthiness. Crafting a ship wasn't just practical, it was cultural pride. A ship meant adventure, exploration, conquest, and, yes, better food options beyond porridge. Yet shipbuilding was also an exercise in patience, craftsmanship, and community teamwork. Imagine yourself carefully bending wooden planks, painstakingly hammering iron nails, and coating seams with sticky pitch. Each task was precise, deliberate, and vital. Vikings didn't rush their work. They knew the ocean didn't forgive careless carpentry. Historians continue to marvel at how these vessels managed to cross oceans, raid distant shores, and trade with cultures thousands of miles away. It's proof that Vikings weren't just fierce warriors, they were skilled craftsmen and masterful seafarers. Speaking of seafaring, let's briefly revisit the idea of Viking clothing. Remember your nighttime layers? Well, daytime attire wasn't any simpler. Your wool and linen garments had to keep you warm, dry, and mobile through all activities from fishing to raiding to negotiating with suspiciously friendly strangers in foreign ports. Fashion trends, not a Viking concern. Warmth and durability, non-negotiable. Your shoes were likely leather, your cloak fastened with a practical brooch, no designer labels or style magazines needed. If it kept frostbite at bay, it was Viking chic. Interestingly, Vikings had a flair for accessories, but strictly functional ones. Your belt wasn't decorative. It held your knife, coin pouch, and any other necessary tools. Jewelry was minimal and practical, often serving dual purposes as trade currency or status symbols rather than just adornment. Even hair braids had practical benefits, keeping long hair neat during hard labor, sailing, or battle. Vikings understood style could exist without sacrificing function. Fashionable, maybe not by modern standards. Functional, absolutely. As your morning activities unfold, farming, fishing, shipbuilding, you begin to appreciate the relentless practicality that defines Viking life. Every action, every decision prioritized survival, warmth, and readiness. Comfort, that was a distant luxury. But satisfaction from a well-built ship, a bountiful catch, or successful farming season, that was tangible and deeply rewarding. Viking life might seem harsh from your modern perspective, but to Vikings it was simply reality. One they mastered through sheer determination, adaptability, and an endless willingness to face discomfort head-on. And now, with your morning chores complete, you're ready for whatever the day brings next, whether it's farming, sailing, or casually sharpening your axe. Remember, every Viking day begins with survival but ends with stories, community, and maybe a bit of humor at your neighbor's expense. Go forth, friend, confident that today's challenges will become tonight's sagas. Keep your axe sharp, your wits sharper, and watch those chickens closely. They're always plotting something.